Welcome, everyone. My name is Michaela Clauser. I'm the Associate Director for Producer Education here at NCBA. Glad to have you all here with us tonight and learn another way to manage your risk. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. As a participant, your line will be muted, but please feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen during the webinar, and at the end of the presentation, we'll get to as many of those as time will allow. If you are having trouble with your technology or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar will be recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at ncba.org. Just check out the producer tab. The webinar tonight, titled Pasture, Range, and Forage, a Tool for Your Toolbox, will feature Dr. James Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness at the University of Arkansas and an extension livestock economist with the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. James earned his undergrad and master's degrees from Oklahoma State University and a PhD in agricultural economics from Kansas State University. Mitchell leads integrated research and extension programs that address issues that span the livestock and meat supply chain. His extension programming primarily focuses on livestock marketing and risk management. Mitchell's recent research has focused on biosecurity in foreign animal diseases, cattle traceability and identification, price discovery in fed cattle markets, and consumer preference for beef attributes. Dr. Mitchell, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the introduction. Let me go ahead and kick this into full screen. Yep. So appreciate everyone's time tonight. Appreciate everyone being here. Appreciate the invite. I know this time of year is especially busy for all of our cattle producers. So I do want to respect your time and try and stay on time with tonight's talk. Hopefully with some good time for some conversation afterwards. So to motivate, I guess the talk for tonight is on Pasture, Range, and Forage. It's an insurance product. So I just got done about an hour ago with another webinar in Arkansas talking about drought, and we're getting hit pretty hard right now with drought in the state, and hindsight's 2020, but it never really does feel great to be in a position where you have to ask yourself, man, I wish I had done something. And risk management it's really about planning for all the potential things that could happen. It's less important to talk about the things that are happening, because by that time, when you're in the middle of a high risk situation, it's a lot harder to manage your way out of it. And so a risk management plan, developing a risk management strategy for your operation, it's a very subjective conversation, starting with identifying the goals and objectives for your individual operation, and finding ways to utilize all the different tools that are out there to develop a risk management strategy that would allow you to manage some of that risk and take some of that risk off the table, which is again subjective, because different people are willing to tolerate and live with a different amount of risk. And one of those tools that could fit into a larger risk management strategy is what's called Pasture, Range, Land, and Forage insurance. It's a rainfall index insurance product. And so the goal for my talk tonight, I'm not trying to sell anybody an insurance policy. I'm not an insurance agent. Really more just focused on talking about this program, how it works, how it might be utilized on your operation, and then walk through some examples along the way. And so definitely not trying to sell anything to anybody. Even at the end of this talk, I'm actually going to probably talk through some reasons why you might be skeptical of this program as well. So kind of being a full transparent talk on all the different aspects of this program. And so talking about risk, a big part of that is sitting down with pen and paper and talking about what are all the things that could happen, what are all the things that could go wrong. And in economics, we classify risk into two categories. There's price risk, where prices that we receive for our farm products are different from maybe what we expected those prices to be earlier in the year. Production risk, same concept, just related to the idea that realized production is different from maybe what we expected it to be earlier in the year. And so there's, livestock production risk, there's forage production risk, and there's crop production risk. So really two categories for identifying the different types of risks that we are subject to in the cattle business. And the one that this program we're talking about tonight deals with is forage production. So we're going to spend our time talking about a risk management tool for managing risk associated with forage production on our farms. Thinking through then, we talked about the different types of risks that are out there, and then also thinking through what are the different sources or factors that contribute to that risk for forage production. So there's pests, weeds, wildfires, inputs, both availability and costs, and then rainfall, both the quantity and the timeliness of rainfall. And so I've pictured two examples of forage production risks for us. Top one just being a lack of rainfall, and the bottom one, which was a huge issue for us in the Southeast last fall, was the fall armyworm. So an example of a pest that represents a risk for forage production on our operations. And so managing these sources of forage production risk through all the different strategies that are available to us. What happens when we're faced with a forage production risk where either through a lack of forage production on our pastures or a lack of hay production, it's a very high consequence outcome for us. Buying supplemental feed, finding, buying, and trying to haul hay to our operations, especially challenging this year. Making tough decisions about having to cull some or all of our cow herd, and then changing our marketing strategies for our fall calves, for example, are all things that come with facing a lack of forage production on our operations. So a very, very high consequence outcome for us, trying to find ways to manage this source of risk for us, in addition to all the other types of risks that are out there for us as well. When we typically put together these risk management webinars, they usually focus about price risk management, and for good reason. There's a lot of different tools out there for us to manage price risk, for example. So futures, options on futures, livestock risk protection, forward contracts, lots of different tools to manage price risk. And so a lot of these webinars do tend to talk about managing price risk. And so when we think about what's out there for us to manage forage production, historically, there really hasn't been a whole lot out there in terms of products to manage forage production risks. Most of all of those strategies have really just relied on good forage management, farm management strategies. So forage diversification, soil fertility, both tests and strategies to improve soil health, hay tests, and then just good grazing management. An example in Arkansas is the Arkansas 300-day grazing program, where we're trying to minimize the number of days that we have to feed hay on our farms. And so historically, not a whole lot out there in terms of ways to manage forage production risk, which is, you could say almost a little surprising given how important forage production is for raising cattle. It is the most fundamental, most important thing probably for us, is just managing forage and producing quality forage for our livestock. And so really nothing out there for quite a while. What we're talking about tonight is a relatively newer product, pasture rangeland forage insurance. Again, it's a rainfall index product. And so a bit of an introduction to this program. So it is an area-based insurance product offered by USDA RMA. It's designed for our perennial forages, both pasture land for grazing and for hay. And so USDA RMA is the risk management agency. Those are the same folks that put on the rest of the federal crop insurance program. So the same people that put out crop insurance are the ones that put out PRF is what we'll call it. And so it's a subsidized crop insurance program. And so those premiums, or the cost of purchasing a PRF policy, are subsidized, so making it more affordable and potentially more accessible to a larger group of people. And since it is a subsidized product where some of that premium is subsidized by the federal government, in the long run, we would expect the indemnity payments, the amount we receive from a loss, to exceed the premium costs. And then it's what's called a single peril crop insurance product, which means that it's only related to losses from a lack of precipitation. So nothing to do with pests, weeds, fires, anything else, solely focusing on rainfall. And it's designed to try and help us with replacement feed costs if we have a lack of forage production due to a lack of rainfall. So rainfall would be the factor triggering an indemnity payment from a PRF policy. And it is a relatively new, so keyword relative, was first really a pilot program in 2007, was available in most states, including Arkansas, in 2012. By about 2013, 2014, it became available nationally. So for every state, this is a product that can be purchased by a producer. And then there are some aspects of PRF that have changed over time, and in some ways of expanding the program, and they're still having discussions about other ways to potentially change this program or expand it or tweak it a bit to kind of see ways of improving PRF. So very much still a point of open discussion with regards to designing PRF in the future. So PRF, pasture, rangeland, and forage, it's a rainfall index product. So we're not directly insuring against a decrease in forage production on our farms. Instead, what we're doing is we're going to use rainfall as a proxy for forage production. So we're insuring against a decline in forage production, which is caused by a lack of precipitation. And the reason that we're using rainfall as a quote proxy is that mainly it's just easier to manage in a very consistent way for everyone, as opposed to trying to develop an insurance product that would directly be insuring a decline in forage production. Listed a bunch of bullets as to why doing so might be more complicated. So if we're talking about trying to directly manage forage production for hay, things to consider would be bale size, number of cuttings, for measuring forage production, growing condition, forage types, or measuring cool season versus warm season. If we're talking about cool season, are we talking about Kentucky, tall fescue? And then finally, who would measure all of those variables? Would that be something that you'd have to do yourself on your farm? Would it be something that's measured for the county, maybe, for all of those different forage types? You can see how, just considering all the different types of forage that are out there, how trying to develop an insurance product around forage production directly would be incredibly challenging, would be very, very hard to try and do. And so instead, we've got this program, PRF, that is insuring against a decline in rainfall. And to the extent that rainfall is strongly correlated and a good predictor for forage production, it allows us to insure against a decline in forage production because rainfall is directly related and a pretty strong indicator of forage production during the growing season. Briefly, just looking at the data for 2021. So throughout the talk tonight, I'm going to use Arkansas as an example. That's where I live and work, but this same data is available for every state as well through the RMA website. So this isn't something unique to the state, but looking at kind of what acreage enrollment looked like for the program last year, some counties in Southwest Arkansas, more so kind of Northeast, kind of along the Delta. Total enrollment for 2021 was about 90,000 acres, so pretty low enrollment actually in Arkansas last year. In terms of top states that do utilize PRF, listed the top 5 by acreage enrolled in millions of acres. So Texas kind of leading in terms of number of acres enrolled in PRF, followed by Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and then total U.S. enrollment in PRF in terms of acreage, about 172 million acres. If you look at this data, 5 years ago, probably a third of that. So seeing quite a bit of growth in terms of number of acres put into one of these PRF policies, past couple of years, especially. Let's see. Before we dive into kind of how this program works, just covering some basic terminology here for us to review, make sure that we're all kind of talking about the same thing. These are all terms that will come up kind of throughout the discussion tonight. So the indemnity payment would be the amount that is paid to a producer from a loss of forage production due to a decline in rainfall. Premium would be the cost of purchasing a PRF insurance policy. Subsidy rate is the proportion or amount of that premium that would be covered by the federal government, hence the name subsidized crop insurance. And then the producer premium would be the cost of a PRF policy that a producer actually pays to buy one of these policies. So just some terms to be familiar with if you're not used to having conversations about crop insurance, for example. Let's see, there we go. And so earlier I described that this is an area-based insurance product. So for crop insurance, area-based would mean it's an insurance product based on county level yields or county level revenues. PRF insurance is an area-based insurance product, but it's based off of rainfall for a gridded system. And so the policy is based on the grid that you would select. So it's not based on precipitation that's on your farm. We're not measuring precipitation on your farm in the same way a county yield is not necessarily a yield on your farm. It's the rainfall or precipitation in a specific grid and for all of the grids in the program. So the USDA RMA website has what's called the grid locator, and this is how you would determine which grid your farm would be in. And so, for example, I typed in the address for the Southwest Arkansas Research and Extension Center in Hempstead County, southwest part of the state, just north of Hope. Use this just as an example. It's where I was a few days ago. And so there's one of two ways you can look up what grid you would fall in. One is just to write in the address, or you can drop a pin. And so when you do so, it tells you, the county, the state, the grid ID, and the longitude and latitude. And so each of these grids, each of these boxes on this map, so these red rectangles are, 0.25 by 0.25 longitude, which at the equator would equate to about a 12 mile by 12 mile grid. And so for some states, that could be an entire county. For other states, you could have several of these grids in a county. And when you've got some land, for example, that might straddle a grid line, you can choose either or for which grid to put your forage acreage in. So if you're on the boundary of two, you can pick either or. How you would do so probably would be to look at the historic data in terms of rainfall indices and see which grid potentially matches better with on-farm rainfall. And so the number that's really, really important to remember is what that grid ID is. That's going to be how you look up information with regards to that grid, rainfall data specifically. So how do we measure precipitation on a grid system? So this map to the left is the number of reporting weather stations for each grid. So red would mean there's 6. The white color would mean there's 0 reporting weather stations for that grid. And so you can kind of see what weather station coverage looks like across the country, in kind of parts of the Corn Belt, California, Washington, Oregon, 6 weather stations, so good coverage. Ports of the Southern Plains, really good coverage as well, but Northern Plains, parts of Montana, New Mexico, you can see much more sparse in terms of coverage. But basically, what happens is NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, collects precipitation from these weather stations on a daily basis for 11 2-month intervals. And this data goes back all the way to 1948. And so it collects that precipitation data on a daily basis using the 4 closest weather stations to the center point of each grid, it calculates a rainfall index. And so what these indices are, one is the expected index value, which would represent kind of long run average normal precipitation for a grid for a specified 2-month interval. And then it also calculates for a given year the actual index value. So what was observed for a certain 2-month period for each individual grid. And it compares for each 2-month interval what actual precipitation was relative to expected or the long run average precipitation is for each individual grid. And so if based off that actual index value, it was below the expected index value and below a specified coverage level, that would trigger a loss in precipitation and would result in an indemnity payment. So again, it's calculating normal precipitation using a lot of historic data, and then each 2-month period, it calculates what was observed that year, and it compares it relative to the historic long run average to determine whether there was below normal precipitation. And it does this for 11 2-month intervals, and it does this for every single grid on the map. What that index would actually look like. So using that same example for Arkansas, for Hempstead County grid 16346, I've collected the rainfall index for 5 years. And again, it calculates that rainfall index for 11 of these 2-month periods. So January, February, February, March, March, April, all the way down to November, December. So this reflects rainfall for that 2-month interval for that year relative to the long run average. So in this table, a number that equals 100 means that for that 2-month period, there was normal precipitation in this grid in Hempstead County, Arkansas. If a number is equal to or greater than 101, that means that we had above average precipitation during that 2-month interval for that specified year. And then finally, a number that is less than 99, so 0 to 99, means that for that 2-month interval for that year, we had below average rainfall in this grid in Hempstead County, Arkansas. And so the indemnity payment that you would receive for a loss in precipitation is triggered when this index value for a specified 2-month period is below a selected coverage level. And so we'll cover more on coverage levels in those monthly periods shortly. But so to purchase a PRF policy, there's about 5-6 decisions that a producer would have to make. Intended use, number of acres to insure, select that coverage level or that threshold that would trigger an indemnity if that rainfall index is below that coverage level, productivity factor, and then which 2-month intervals to insure coverage in, and how much value to assign to those intervals that you want to insure coverage in as well. And we're going to go into more detail on each of these. So first would be the intended use. So if you were purchasing a PRF policy, you would have to choose the intended use of the insured forage. So you can choose it to either be grazing acreage or it can be hay acreage. Insured acreage that is intended to be used as grazing has a lower premium, so it's going to be cheaper to purchase a grazing policy than it would be for a hay policy, but it also is going to have lower indemnity payments for grazing acreage when a loss is triggered. So insuring acreage for hay production is more expensive, but if a loss is triggered, you're also going to have a higher indemnity payment to cover the loss in forage that resulted from a decline in precipitation for your chosen grid. Insured acreage and coverage level. So the next 2 decisions you'd have to make about your individual policy. You'd have to choose how many acres to insure with a PRF policy. And so unlike crop insurance where you'd insure the whole eligible crop, for PRF, you don't have to insure all of your forage acreage. You can insure some, and there's no limitation on what that number has to be. So after you've chosen, okay, is this going to be hay acreage or is this going to be pasture land for grazing? Insured acreage would be the amount of acreage that we're going to insure with a PRF policy. Then you want to choose the coverage level, which is the index value that triggers an indemnity payment when realized precipitation is below it for an interval, right? So going back a couple slides, let's say you choose 90% coverage level and you're insuring in the November, December 2-month interval, an indemnity payment would be triggered because precipitation was only 60.5% of normal, which is also below the 90% coverage level. Let's say in 2020, you insured coverage in that same November, December time period, and you also chose the 90% or the 70% coverage level, for example. And so rainfall was below average November and December in 2020, but since it's still above that 70% coverage level, a loss would not have triggered and you would not have received an indemnity payment because it's based off of having to be below normal precipitation and below whatever chosen coverage level you have for your PRF policy. And so the coverage level is going to range from 90% to 70% in 5% increments. So 90, 85, 80, 75, 70. And the subsidy rate, so the amount of that premium that would be covered by the federal government is also going to range by coverage level. So your lower coverage level is going to have a higher subsidy rate. Your highest coverage level, 90, is only going to have a 51% subsidy rate. And so when we're thinking about which coverage level you'd like to think about, well, obviously a 90% coverage level is more likely to trigger, right? Precipitation is going to be below 90% of normal before it's below 70% of normal. So more likely to have an indemnity payment triggered if you select a higher coverage level. But those higher coverage levels are also more expensive to purchase. So a 70% coverage level PRF policy would be cheaper than selecting a 90% coverage level for your policy. Then you have to choose the productivity factor for the acreage that you're going to be insuring. And so USDA RMA calculates a county base value of production for each county for forage production. And in the example that I've been using, Hempstead County, Arkansas, the base county value of production would be $59.50 per acre. And so when you choose your productivity factor, you're choosing how much of that county base value you want to insure. And so you're basically choosing how much coverage do you want to buy. And so you could choose 100% productivity factor, which means that you're buying $599.50 per acre. You could buy, for acreage that might be higher quality, you could choose a higher productivity factor, or you could choose a lower productivity value. So basically you're changing the amount of protection that you're buying for your PRF policy. And so higher productivity factors are going to give you a higher dollar amount per acre of coverage, but they're also more expensive. But if a loss is triggered for a lack of rainfall, those indemnity payments would also be larger as well for a higher productivity factor. And then the final decisions you have to make is, all right, you've decided if it's grazing acreage or hay acreage. You've decided the number of acres to insure, the coverage level, and the productivity factor of the acreage you're insuring. Now you need to take that amount of coverage and assign it to the different 2-month intervals to protect against a low precipitation outcome. So at a minimum, you have to assign value to 2 of those 2-month intervals, but you cannot exceed 6 of those 2-month intervals. And those intervals cannot be overlapping. So you can't insure value in the January-February interval and the February-March interval. You could choose the January-February interval and the March-April interval, but they cannot overlap, no overlapping months. And so for the intervals that you'd like to insure and buy coverage in, you choose how to allocate that coverage across the intervals. And so it can be a max of 60% for any one of those intervals or a minimum of 10% for any one of those 2-month intervals. And at a maximum, you can assign coverage to a max of 6 of those 2-month intervals. So looking at kind of, what this looks like and what producers typically do. So this is a summary of enrollment for 2021 for Arkansas. And so when you're choosing which of these intervals to assign coverage to, there's a couple different approaches that you could take. You could distribute coverage evenly across these intervals. If most producers have year-round forage availability between cool and warm season forage, so evenly distribute coverage among these intervals. You could maybe do something where for a specific forage, you want to assign value to the intervals that most closely align with the growing season for a specific forage. Or you could do a more of an all-in approach and assign as much value to two of these intervals as possible, so more targeted specific interval approach. Throwing all of the value into two of these intervals would certainly give you a large indemnity payment if a loss is triggered, but at the same time, if a loss isn't triggered, you're not going to get anything. So distributing it more among more intervals actually might increase the likelihood that you get an indemnity payment, but it might not be as large as if you were to throw all of that coverage into two of these intervals, for example. So 50% in the January, February, and 50% in the March, April intervals, for example. And so in a way, you could think of that latter approach as kind of being more of a gamble if a loss isn't triggered. The natural question to ask is, okay, well, how should I, do I choose these intervals to kind of match my forage production and risk, or do I just want to maximize the likelihood that I'm going to get a payment for my PRF policy? And so what this graph shows us is the probability that a loss is triggered for each of these 2-month intervals for the different coverage levels that you could choose in Arkansas. And so a 2-month interval for September, October, for a 90% coverage level, there's a 55% probability that a loss would be triggered. On the other end of that, for that same September, October interval, a 70% coverage level, you'd be about 30 to 35% probability that a loss is triggered. So by coverage level and by the intervals, how likely is it that a loss to be triggered and that you receive a payment? And this data is based off of Arkansas specifically. But again, same kind of patterns in other states as well. And so do I want to match my forage production and risks, or do I want to assign coverage to the intervals that are most likely to result in an indemnity payment? Talk about the pros and cons of both of those later. So while, for example, in Arkansas, across all the coverage levels, September and October is the most likely interval where an indemnity payment would be issued because of a loss in precipitation. Those intervals are also going to be the more expensive ones. So this shows you what the average premium per acre is and the variability in those premiums for each of these intervals. So across the intervals, on average in 2021, the average premium was $10.69 an acre. So the cost of purchasing a PRF policy averaged $10.69 per acre. And so you see that average premium is higher during the September-October interval, even though it's more likely to trigger a loss. Same thing for hay acreage. So that previous graph was the premium rates for on a dollar per acre basis for grazing pasture land. Same thing for haying acreage as well. So policies for haying acreage are more expensive. So in Arkansas last year, the average premium was $38.57, and much more variability in those premiums for haying acreage than grazing acreage. But the same pattern matches that the months that are more likely to result in an indemnity payment are also the intervals that are going to be more expensive to purchase coverage for. So kind of that was a quick and fast covering all the basics of it. And the easiest way probably to see how that all actually works is to work through an example of this. And so on USDA's website, they've got an RMA decision tool. And with that decision tool, again, that's how you'd find your grid. You could look up historic rainfall indices, and then you could look at how different policies what they would cost and what their indemnity payments might look like historically. So using this tool, we can see how those different decisions impact how much a policy would cost and how it would impact an indemnity payment if a loss was triggered. And so working through an example is probably the most straightforward way to see how all these concepts come together and work for PRF. So if you go to that website, you've got to put in the location of your grid. So that's illustrated here at the top. So state, Hempstead, you know your grid number, so you can click the drop-down menu and find the grid. So the grid example that we're using is 16346, the grid in Hempstead County, Arkansas. And on the left, those are all of the protection information decisions that you have to make for your PRF policy. And so we just talked about all of these. So intended use, you could choose haying or grazing. For hay acreage, you'd have to choose if it's irrigated hay or non-irrigated. And for a PRF policy, if it's irrigated hay acreage, it's also going to base the policy on the added cost of having to pump more water. Organic practices for hay acreage as well. But after you've chosen the intended use is grazing, so for this example, we're going to look at a PRF policy for grazing pasture land. You choose your coverage level that you want to use, so 90%. Productivity factor, so how much of that county base value do we want to purchase coverage for? Let's just stick with 100% for easy math. And then let's insure 100 acres for the year 2021. And so insured acreage, you can type in any number. There's no limitation on what that has to be, so you don't have to insure all of your pasture acreage in a PRF policy. But once you put in these variables, which are the decisions you have to make about your policy, it kicks out this information on the right. So for Hempstead County, the county base value of forage production is $59.50 per acre. The dollar amount of protection that we're purchasing per acre is going to be $53.55, and we'll talk about how that's calculated in a minute. We've already said that we're insuring 100 acres. The total amount of protection that we're purchasing is $5,355 for those 100 acres. And so the next decisions you have to make is which intervals do you want to assign that $5,355 worth of protection to? So you assign a percentage of that total policy protection to these different intervals, and at a maximum, you can put 60% of this $5,355 into an individual 2-month interval. So the way that your dollar amount of protection is calculated, so it's the county base value times your coverage level times your productivity factor, right? So the productivity factor was 100, so we're just going to insure 100% of the county base value, and we chose a county or a coverage level of 90%. So multiply those three things together, and you get $53.55 of protection per acre. And then the total amount of protection is just multiplying that dollar amount of protection times the number of acres that you're going to insure with this policy, which would equal $5,355. Since it's 100, it just equates to easy math. And then we just have to decide how we want to allocate that protection we're buying across the different intervals for the rainfall index. So a busy table as an example. So in this example, again, at a maximum, we can assign value to 6 of these intervals and at a minimum of 2. And so looking at the different intervals that are available, in this example, I've evenly distributed our coverage across 5 intervals. 20% of that coverage is in the March-April interval, 20% of that coverage is in the May-June interval, 20% is in the July-August, and 20% of that 5,355 is in that September-October interval. And so that is 20% of 5,355 is $1,071. And so that's how you're allocating your coverage again across these different rainfall intervals. And then once you've done that, you can press calculate, and RMA's website will calculate out all the values that are of interest. So how much this policy would cost, what the indemnity payments would have been for 2021, for example. So you can go back historically for any year that you'd like and punch in this policy information to see how this particular policy would have paid in previous years. And so again, you're assigning that total coverage to these different rainfall index intervals. And so if you sum up $1,071 times 5 is going to be the total amount of coverage that we purchased. The total cost of this policy, again, it's the amount of protection in that interval times USDA's calculated premium rate, and that's going to give you what the total cost of that policy is for that specific interval. So in this example, $1,071 times a premium rate of 19.65% is equal to $210 of premium for the September-October interval. The amount that you would actually pay to ensure coverage in that interval is equal to the total premium times 1 minus the subsidy rate. So again, this is subsidized, so a 91% coverage level is subsidized at 51%. So the actual cost that you would pay to put coverage in that September-October 2-month interval would be equal to $103. And again, it's calculating all of those numbers for each row or for each interval that you've assigned coverage to. Then it calculates out what your indemnity payments would have been for that year. So in this example, we're using 2021. And so our coverage, for example, in that September-October interval was 20% of that $5,355, so $1,071. You multiply that by the difference between your coverage level and what the actual index value was. So for September-October of last year in this grid in Hempstead County, Arkansas, it was very, very dry. Precipitation was only 41.5% of normal. And so your coverage level was 90%. So 90, which is your coverage level, minus the actual index value divided by 90 is your payment rate. And so your indemnity payment for that 2-month period would be $577. For example, 2, for March and April, if we look at the index value, the actual index value was 112.1. And so rainfall for that 2-month period in this grid was above average. It was 12% above normal. And then same thing for the May-June interval, it was above normal. And so for those months where the index value was greater than 100, of course, that means precipitation was above normal, and so it wouldn't have triggered a loss, which results in an indemnity payment. But the total policy, so this bottom row, it's going to calculate out on a per acre basis what it costs and what it paid. So assigning value to these 5 intervals at 20% resulted in a producer paying $4.51 per acre, and indemnity payments equaled $9.29 per acre. So a positive return on purchasing this PRF policy. But talking to producers that actually purchase PRF, assigning value evenly across 5 of these intervals is probably something that is not done as often as the kind of maximize the probability of receiving a payment. So for example, the 2 highest enrollment time periods is September, October, followed by the January, February intervals. And so what if instead of distributing that coverage kind of evenly among these intervals, we instead decided to try and use a strategy where we're maximizing the likelihood that we'd get paid? So what if, again, we just changed the policy to assign 50% of that value for the January, February interval and 50% of our coverage to the September, October interval. And we did that because those 2 intervals are the highest likely to issue an indemnity payment because of a loss being triggered. August and September and October and November are also high likely probabilities of loss being triggered. But again, you can't have overlapping intervals. So for example, let's just choose January, February, September, October as an alternative strategy here. And so with this strategy, if we assign our coverage to just 2 of these intervals for September, October, for example, that 2-month period where precipitation was only 41.5% of normal, we get an indemnity payment of $1,443. So a much bigger indemnity payment because we assigned more of our coverage to that time period. But at the same time, we assigned more value to that January, February interval as well. And there was no estimated indemnity because rainfall was 43.6% above normal rainfall for that grid. And so if, for example, it had not been below average precipitation for September, October, or January, February, then you wouldn't have gotten anything out of this because you assign much more value to just two of these time periods as opposed to a more kind of evenly distributed approach. But we did get a higher per acre indemnity as well. So for this policy, when we assigned our coverage to just two of those intervals, our per acre indemnity was $14.43. So in this example, it worked out that we actually got a higher indemnity. But again, it's more of a gamble if you place more value in those, in a fewer number of those monthly intervals. And so kind of that's how it works. That's how you would use that decision to support tool to kind of assess different PRF policies. Kind of a couple things to think about that might be reason to be skeptical of this, or kind of reasons to kind of think through more carefully the implications. One would be the idea of basis risk with PRF insurance. So when we typically think about basis risk, we think about kind of futures prices and local cash prices diverging. In the same way, you're insuring against a decline in rainfall, but it's not on your farm. They're not measuring precipitation on your farm. It's based off of a grid. And so the precipitation on your farm, for example, could be different from the precipitation on your neighbor's farm down the road, which could be different from the precipitation for the grid that you're purchasing your PRF policy for. And so all of those can be different. And so, for example, it could be bone dry on your farm, but the grid had pretty solid rainfall. And so that'd be an example where precipitation on your farm doesn't closely follow precipitation measured for the grid using the 4 closest weather stations. And so the idea that the correlation between the rainfall index and forage production, if those diverge, you could still very much be exposed to risk if it's not tracking very closely with forage production on your farm. And then other things to kind of think about too would be, you know, the relationship between precipitation and forage. Well, there's other things there that impact forage production as well. So what about heat? So you could have a good year in terms of precipitation, but heat could be another factor here limiting forage production. So how closely the relationship between precipitation and forage yield really matters for how well this problem or this product helps ensure forage production risk. And then does the grid size and weather station coverage matter? So would a smaller grid or better coverage of weather station improve the measurement of precipitation relative to precipitation on your farm? And then going back to that example, looking at what that indemnity payment was for that 100 acres, you know, we only had a couple months where we were below average precipitation. So our indemnity payments were not crazy big, right? So thinking through, given those indemnity payments, how much you allocate those indemnity payments towards calculating or budgeting for purchasing feed. So for example, if you really are relying on that acreage and it has a lot of value, maybe increasing the productivity factor to ensure more coverage in your PRF policy might help in that situation as well. So that's kind of what I've got in terms of how PRF works and how it might fit into your risk management program. Just some final resources to think through if you want to do some homework on this stuff as well. So first is the RMA website, the PRF support tool, and then for purchasing a PRF policy, this final link will take you to the agent locator to find a crop insurance agent that sells PRF policies. And then finally, this website here is the Fryer Price Risk Management Center that we've got here. I'm at the University of Arkansas. I'll have a copy of these slides published on this website for those that are interested in going back and reviewing some of this, along with my contact information if you'd like to visit privately more about this as well. So that's what I've got for us tonight. Appreciate everyone's time again. Happy to hang out and have a discussion about this or anything else that might be going on.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing such valuable information with us tonight. NCBA is always all about providing the best information, and you certainly helped us accomplish that. You provided some really great resources, and again, if anyone would like to go back and rewatch or anything, this webinar was recorded and will be available on ncba.org underneath the producer tab here in a couple days. So encourage folks to go back. And then we also have a risk management page on ncba.org as well. You can go there and check out some additional resources and then take a survey just to provide us feedback about questions in this topic that you have, as well as what you plan to implement. So yeah, we appreciate everyone going and taking a look at those resources and then taking the survey. With that, we will get to some Q&A. So Dr. Mitchell, we have a couple clarifying questions coming in. So as a smaller producer, some folks want to know if there is a minimum number of acres that can be enrolled. And then, on the flip side of that, is there a maximum number that can be enrolled?
As far as I know, no. So you could insure 1 or 1,000 if you wanted. I used
Great.
100 in this example, which is a relatively small number of acres for a PRF policy. But no, there's
Mm-hmm.
no, for smaller producers, this is something that can be accessible to them as well.
Great. And do you see this program benefiting, the smaller producers as much as the larger producers? Do you see it kind of benefiting kind of both sides?
Yeah, so I guess one thing so for this tool that's kind of nice is you can see, what this would cost before you purchase it, right? And so to the extent that you know how much this would cost, you could throw this into a cow calf budget, for example, and kind of see what this policy would cost you on a per cow basis in a cow calf enterprise budget. And so knowing that cost up front is nice. And then, for smaller producers, the single biggest cost for cow calf operations for cattle producers is the cost of producing harvested feed, so hay. And
Mm-hmm.
so for smaller producers on a per cow basis, that cost of producing hay is going to be significantly higher. And during times when you've got really, really expensive supplemental feed prices for those smaller producers, yes, this can be something that can benefit them just purely from the standpoint of those forage production costs are much higher on a per cow basis for a smaller operation.
Great, that's good to know. Additionally, does a producer have to own the acres? So what if a producer runs all their cows on lease ground or and rented ground? Do they still qualify for? Does this still qualify for them as the renter?
Yeah, so one of the variables there that I kind of covered, not covered really at all. So in the decisions that you would make, you can change the insurable interest, which would be kind of your ownership share in that acreage. So it doesn't have to be something that's 100% owned by you.
Okay. Um, and then, so you mentioned that this program is still evolving. Um, this is just kind of an opinion question, but how would you like to see it to continue um, to improve, or what aspects of it can continue to improve?
So the single biggest thing that's changed, or not changed, just addition to. So more recently, it's a separate program, but it works the same way. They've included annual forages too. So now you can insure winter annuals with a PRF policy as well. So that's probably one of the bigger things that changed in terms of things I'd like to see kind of change with this. Kind of on the back end of that talk, probably the single biggest question and probably the most researchable question from an academic standpoint is really that issue or concern about how strongly does that index correlate with precipitation on your farm, and how well does precipitation correlate with forage production? Again, basis risk. And so what's the extent of that problem? There's some research out there that's tried to look at that. But again, to be able to assess that problem, you have to have access to, very much farm level data, which is not always easy to get. And you'd have to manage actual forage production on those operations. And so I think kind of an area that not necessarily want to see change, but something I'd like to see more answers on, and more research-based recommendations on, is kind of, what's the extent of the difference between on-farm precipitation and precipitation as measured by that index. So for example, if you looked at that map that showed all those locations where all those weather stations are, there are some states where it's pretty sparse. So like Montana, New Mexico, I think didn't have very many, but we've got a lot of acreage in New Mexico that's insured with PRF. So documenting, on a state by state, grid by grid basis, what kind of basis risk is there for producers is, I think, an important part to help them better assess how this program might work into a bigger, larger kind of risk management plan.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then, so we have time for one more question. This is kind of switching subjects a little bit, but um, when implementing a PRF plan, do you see a value to already having a grazing management plan in place, or do you see these two um, can you kind of couple these two together, or how important would that be to have a grazing management plan in place and then purchasing a PRF insurance?
Oh, I think it's one of those things where it all kind of works collaboratively together. I think having good on-farm management with our forage coupled with a PRF policy is certainly something that could kind of work better together than kind of separately, in my opinion. Because I think just in general, risk management isn't any one thing that you do. It's kind of the combination of everything that you're doing. And so, in the same way that for, priced risk management, you might be hedged, but that doesn't mean that livestock marketing doesn't matter anymore, right? It helps to have both instead of just one. In that example, that'd be kind of a complementary example on the price risk side. But yeah, I think it's one of those things where having one versus having both is certainly an advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree that the topic of risk management certainly spans from from what you traditionally think about with price all the way to production practices. So that's a really good point.
Yeah,
Um,
it's about kind of sitting down and seeing how all those things could fit together to help you kind of reach your risk management goals, which will look different for everybody. But again, it's just one of those things that should work in unison with all the other things that you're doing on your farm to help you manage risk better.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Mitchell, and for everyone for joining us tonight. Um, Again, you can check out the recording and see Dr. Mitchell's resources that he shared and his contact information there. And I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you.